Good evening. Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. He was found at his home in Memphis, not breathing. His road manager tried to revive him. He failed. A hospital tried to revive him. It failed. His doctor pronounced him dead at 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, dead at 42. Was it really just a tragic end to an iconic life? Or was there something much darker lurking behind his sudden passing? What if we told you that the official cause of death isn't the whole truth? Was Elvis Presley really a victim of a drug overdose? Elvis Aaron Presley, just the name alone carries a certain magic. Born on January 8, 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi, Elvis would go on to become one of the most iconic figures in music history. His sound, style, and energy transformed the landscape of the music industry. With his devil-may-care attitude and magnetic stage presence, Elvis was more than just a performer. He was a cultural phenomenon. His rise to fame was meteoric. In 1956, with the release of Heartbreak Hotel, Elvis became a household name. The king had arrived, and he quickly became synonymous with rock and roll, youth rebellion, and electric energy. His music was different, raw and vibrant, a perfect match for the changing tides of the 50s. The world was his oyster. His fan base was legion, and his influence was undeniable. But beneath the glitz and glamour, things were far from perfect. Elvis's personal life was plagued by struggles that even the most passionate fans would have found hard to imagine. As early as the late 1960s, Elvis had begun to battle with his weight, health, and his mental well-being. It was around this time that many close to him began noticing a darker side of the king. Elvis, like so many other stars, had his demons. Behind his public persona of the charming and charismatic performer, there was a much more complicated figure, one who was increasingly dependent on prescription medication. At first, it seemed harmless. A few pills here and there to manage the stress of a punishing tour schedule and the pressures of fame. But as his career progressed, so did his reliance on these drugs. To understand the darker side of Elvis's life, we need to take a closer look at the growing culture of prescription drug use during the 1960s and 70s. This was a time when doctors were prescribing medications like amphetamines, barbiturates, and painkillers in alarming quantities, many times without a true understanding of the consequences. In fact, Elvis wasn't the only celebrity to fall victim to this culture. But as we'll see in the coming chapters, his story takes a tragic turn. Elvis's personal life also suffered greatly. His marriage to Priscilla Presley was in turmoil. They had been married for almost 6 years, but their relationship was on the rocks by the time Elvis passed away. They had one daughter, Lisa Marie, but despite the joy she brought him, Elvis's inability to balance his family life and his career became increasingly evident. There were rumors of infidelity, and Elvis's own loneliness only seemed to grow as he tried to escape into drugs. The pressures of stardom, combined with his own emotional struggles, took a major toll on Elvis. By the mid-70s, his health was declining. He was overweight, lethargic, and often ill. Despite all of his success, Elvis was battling an invisible enemy, the addiction to prescription drugs that was slowly taking over his life. But it wasn't just about pills. Elvis was also battling the emotional scars from a lifetime of public scrutiny and an inability to adjust to life outside the spotlight. As his addiction deepened, he would spend long hours alone in his Graceland mansion, falling deeper into despair. And by the time 1977 rolled around, Elvis was far from the energetic star he once was. Something had to give, and tragically, it did. By 1977, Elvis Presley was no longer the vibrant, youthful man who had captured the hearts of millions. His health was rapidly deteriorating. Friends, family, and even his closest associates couldn't ignore the signs of trouble anymore. And while the public image of Elvis remained larger than life, those closest to him were beginning to notice just how much his addiction to prescription drugs had taken control of his life. Elvis's drug use had escalated dramatically in the years leading up to his death. It was no longer just about using medication to cope with the pressures of fame. It was about using drugs as a way to escape. In fact, in the months before his death, Elvis was known to have been taking a cocktail of powerful substances, including painkillers, sedatives, and stimulants. His drug regimen was dangerously out of control. Elvis's doctor, Dr. George Nicopolis, was often at the center of controversy. Nicopolis was known to prescribe Elvis large quantities of prescription drugs, sometimes in amounts that were well beyond what would be considered safe for any patient. In the years before his death, Elvis's prescription drug usage became so frequent that some close to him feared for his well-being. It wasn't just painkillers anymore. It was everything. He had become addicted to barbiturates, opiates, amphetamines, and tranquilizers. These substances were meant to help Elvis manage his physical pain, insomnia, and stress, but instead they only made his problems worse. In addition to the drugs, Elvis's eating habits were also spiraling out of control. He had gained a significant amount of weight, and his once powerful stage presence was now a shadow of what it used to be. The King's energy was drained, his performances were lackluster, and his health was starting to give out. On tour, Elvis could barely make it through a show without needing to stop for a break, and his famously smooth voice was beginning to crack under the strain. But it wasn't just the drugs that were affecting Elvis. His emotional state was also deteriorating rapidly. He had begun isolating himself from friends and family. He had even started canceling performances. He was withdrawing from the very world that had once adored him. Despite his personal struggles, Elvis continued to maintain a facade of the king that the public had come to expect. In the weeks before his death, friends and family began to worry even more. Elvis had been found unconscious on several occasions due to overdoses, though he always seemed to recover, much to the relief of those around him. But no one knew just how much longer he could go on this way. By the time of his death, Elvis had become a mere shadow of his former self. His drug abuse had ravaged his body. He was severely malnourished, had high blood pressure, and his organs were beginning to fail. On August 16, 1977, Elvis was found unconscious in his Graceland mansion. His girlfriend Ginger Alden discovered him in a bathroom, and despite efforts to resuscitate him, Elvis was declared dead at the scene. The official cause of death was heart failure, which at first glance seemed like a reasonable explanation. Elvis had suffered from heart issues, and given his weight and overall health, it made sense. But what wasn't mentioned in the official report was the role that his prescription drug addiction may have played. It was clear to those who knew him best that Elvis's body had been under tremendous strain from years of drug abuse. The mystery surrounding Elvis's death didn't end with the coroner's report. In fact, many fans, doctors, and even some of his closest confidants believed that drugs were the true cause of his death. Though the world had lost a legend, the shocking truth remained obscured for years. Was Elvis's heart really the problem? Or was the King's tragic demise the result of something much darker? In the next chapter, we will take a deeper dive into the specifics of Elvis's drug abuse and the shocking revelations that came to light in the years following his death. Stay tuned, because the story behind his final days is more disturbing than you could ever imagine. The image of Elvis Presley as a carefree rock star, always in control, seemed far from the reality of his final years. As we've already discussed, the pressures of stardom combined with personal struggles played a major role in Elvis's downfall. But the most shocking element of his tragic end was the extent of his drug addiction, a secret that was largely kept hidden from the public. The fact that Elvis struggled with prescription drug abuse was something only his closest friends and family truly understood. For the rest of the world, he was still the king, the man who could do no wrong. But behind the curtains of Graceland, there was a darker, more vulnerable side to the king of rock and roll. For years, Elvis had been under the care of several doctors who were responsible for prescribing him various medications to cope with his mental and physical pain. The line between treatment and dependency was a thin one, and unfortunately, Elvis had crossed it long before his death. What many people didn't realize was that Elvis had been struggling with addiction for much longer than most thought. One of the most alarming aspects of Elvis's drug use was his dependence on a combination of prescription painkillers and sedatives. These medications, while effective in the short term, often had devastating long-term effects. Painkillers such as Demerol and Percodan were routinely prescribed to Elvis to help manage the aches and pains that came with his grueling schedule. He also had access to sedatives like Valium and Seconal to help him sleep, especially after long, exhausting tours. These medications didn't just help with his physical pain, they became a crutch for him to cope with the psychological stress of his personal life. It wasn't uncommon for Elvis to use these drugs to numb himself from the emotional toll of his fractured relationships and the relentless expectations placed upon him as the king. His prescription drug use wasn't simply about managing physical ailments, it was a coping mechanism for deep emotional pain. But the prescription drugs were only part of the problem. Elvis also became involved with other substances that contributed to his decline. As his dependency grew, he turned to stronger stimulants like amphetamines to combat fatigue and barbiturates to slow himself down when the effects of the stimulants became too intense. It became a vicious cycle. Drugs to help him stay awake, drugs to help him sleep, and drugs to alleviate pain. Elvis's personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, played a pivotal role in this downward spiral. Dr. Nicopolis, often referred to as Dr. Nick, had been prescribing Elvis large quantities of medication for years, sometimes at quantities that were dangerously high. In fact, Dr. Nicopolis would go on to face charges in the years following Elvis's death, accused of overprescribing drugs to his famous patient. But at the time, he was merely fulfilling what Elvis had come to demand: more medication to maintain his high-flying lifestyle. By 1977, the situation had become unbearable. Despite his public image as the king, Elvis was living in a state of constant physical and emotional turmoil. He was rarely seen without some sort of drug in his system, whether it was to boost his energy or to calm him down. His friends and family knew something was seriously wrong, but the king had always been able to hide his pain behind his charm and his fame. At this point, however, there was no hiding it anymore. Elvis's body was beginning to break down. His organs, weakened by years of drug abuse, were struggling to keep up with the abuse. His heart, which had already been compromised by years of substance use and his unhealthy lifestyle, was beginning to fail him. It was a ticking time bomb. As Elvis's dependency on prescription drugs grew, so did the physical toll it took on his appearance and his mental state. His weight fluctuated dramatically and his once ravishing good looks had faded. His public performances became erratic, with some shows being outright embarrassing. Fans still adored him, but those who were closest to him could see the cracks in the king's armor. Despite all the warning signs, there seemed to be little anyone could do to stop him. Elvis's ability to remain in control of his own life was diminishing rapidly, but the people around him, whether out of fear, loyalty, or disbelief, did little to intervene. His drug addiction was not only an addiction to the substances themselves, but an addiction to the lifestyle of fame and excess that they enabled. Elvis was trapped in a destructive cycle, and the end was drawing closer. But the most shocking aspect of his addiction was that no one had the courage to fully confront it. Those who surrounded him, many of whom had financial or personal interests in his well-being, turned a blind eye to the reality of his health. They were complicit in his addiction, choosing to enable his behavior rather than intervene. The king was losing control, and no one was willing to take the necessary steps to save him. On the morning of August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found dead at his home, Graceland. The news of his death sent shockwaves through the world as millions mourned the loss of the king. For most, the official cause of death, heart failure, seemed to make sense. But as we've seen, there were many signs leading up to this tragic event that pointed to a much more complex set of circumstances surrounding his death. The days leading up to Elvis's death were filled with turmoil. He had been struggling physically and emotionally, and his drug use had reached a breaking point. In fact, Elvis's last few days on Earth were a blur of confusion, lethargy, and despair. His physical health had deteriorated to the point where his body could no longer handle the strain of the drugs he had been consuming for years. But there was something even more shocking that would come to light in the aftermath of his death. On the morning of August 16th, Elvis's girlfriend, Ginger Alden, found him unresponsive in the bathroom of his bedroom. She immediately called for help, and emergency responders arrived at the scene shortly after. Despite their efforts to resuscitate him, Elvis was pronounced dead at the age of 42. The coroner's report initially indicated that the cause of death was heart failure, but this was only a partial explanation. While it was true that Elvis had been suffering from heart problems, it was the underlying cause, his extensive drug abuse, that had truly caused his heart to fail. The toxicology report revealed a shocking truth. Elvis's body was filled with a lethal combination of prescription drugs. The report indicated that the king had a vast array of substances in his system, including painkillers, barbiturates, and sedatives. There was even evidence of polypharmacy, taking multiple drugs at once, which can increase the risk of fatal overdose. His drug addiction, which had been quietly escalating for years, had finally caught up with him. While the official cause of death was heart failure, it was clear to those in the know that drugs were the real culprit. The sheer quantity of drugs found in his system made it clear that Elvis had been living in a constant state of chemical dependency. His body, worn down from years of abuse, could no longer cope with the strain, and ultimately, it gave out. The toxicology report further confirmed that Elvis's death was not a simple accident. It was the culmination of years of prescription drug abuse. The king, who had once ruled the stage and the hearts of millions, had been slowly destroyed by his addiction. The final toll came in the form of a massive heart attack brought on by the combination of drugs and the toll they had taken on his body. Elvis's death was a tragedy, not just for the world but for those who had witnessed his decline firsthand. His closest friends and family members, who had seen him struggle with addiction, were left in mourning but also in disbelief. How had it gotten this far? Why had no one intervened before it was too late? But Elvis's story doesn't end with his death. The aftermath of his passing brought more revelations to light, many of which have left an indelible mark on the public's perception of the king. The true story of Elvis Presley's final days, from the drugs that led to his demise to the shocking revelations that followed, remains one of the most tragic and haunting stories in the history of rock and roll. As the world continues to mourn the loss of Elvis, we are reminded of the dangers of fame, addiction, and the high price that even the most iconic figures must sometimes pay. And while Elvis's music and legacy live on, his tragic death serves as a reminder that no one, not even the king, is immune to the consequences of their own demons. Elvis Presley's death in 1977 was not just the end of an era. It was the beginning of a legacy defined by tragedy, controversy, and questions that still remain unanswered to this day. The world, still reeling from the loss of the king of rock and roll, had to confront a more unsettling truth. Elvis Presley's death was not merely the result of heart failure, as initially reported. It was the culmination of years of self-destructive behavior and addiction, issues that had been quietly brewing in the background while he was still alive. In the aftermath of his death, questions arose not only about the exact cause, but about how someone so beloved, someone with the world at his feet, could fall so far from grace. Many fans couldn't wrap their heads around how the king, a figure who had seemingly had it all, could be so vulnerable to the same struggles that affect millions of people in the shadows. The shocking reality was that Elvis was, in many ways, a prisoner of his own fame, an addict trapped by the very lifestyle that had once made him immortal. One of the most immediate consequences following Elvis's passing was the media frenzy. News outlets around the world seized upon the details of his death, particularly the revelation about his prescription drug use. The toxicology report, which revealed an extensive list of drugs in his system, sent shockwaves through the public. His fans, many of whom had adored him for years, were left to grapple with the disturbing reality that their hero had not been invincible, that behind his public persona was a man who had been struggling for a long time. In the wake of Elvis's death, family members, friends, and even his doctors found themselves under the microscope. Dr. George Nichopoulos, Elvis's longtime physician, became a central figure in the controversy. While Elvis had been seen by multiple doctors, Dr. Nichopoulos was the most frequently mentioned in connection with the drugs Elvis had been prescribed. As details about his medical practices came to light, the public began to question whether his prescription habits had been a contributing factor in the singer's downfall. Dr. Nichopoulos was eventually indicted on charges of over-prescribing medication to Elvis and other patients. He faced legal action and was later stripped of his medical license. However, the damage had already been done. Many believe that his overprescription practices were, in part, responsible for enabling Elvis's addiction to spiral out of control. While Dr. Nichopoulos never directly admitted to causing Elvis's death, the fallout from his actions would forever stain his reputation. The Presley family, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces of a broken legacy. Elvis's daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, was only 9 years old when she lost her father. The grief and trauma from his passing would stay with her throughout her life, compounded by the public nature of her father's death and the media scrutiny that followed. As an adult, Lisa Marie would later speak about the emotional scars left by her father's addiction and death and how she had struggled with the shadow of her father's legacy in her own life. For the public, the death of Elvis Presley was a wake-up call. It highlighted the very real dangers of addiction, especially for those living in the glare of the spotlight. Elvis's tragic end cast a dark shadow over the glamorous world of fame, showing that no amount of wealth or adoration could protect someone from the grip of addiction. His death became a cautionary tale, one that echoed throughout the entertainment industry and beyond. In the years following Elvis's death, many attempts were made to preserve his legacy. Graceland, his iconic mansion in Memphis, quickly became a pilgrimage site for millions of fans who wanted to pay their respects to the king. His music, his charisma, and his influence continued to endure, but so did the questions about the circumstances of his death. The more that was revealed about his drug abuse, the more complex his legacy became. Elvis was no longer just the king of rock and roll. He was also a cautionary figure, a symbol of the dangers of fame and the destructive power of addiction. Despite the controversies and the dark side of his life that came to light after his death, Elvis's impact on music and culture cannot be overstated. He revolutionized rock and roll, influenced generations of musicians, and became a global icon. His songs like Hound Dog, Jailhouse Rock, and Can't Help Falling in Love continue to resonate with audiences to this day. Even though his life was cut short, his music remains timeless, and his place in history as a cultural and musical pioneer is cemented forever. But the haunting question still lingers. Did Elvis Presley die of a drug overdose, or was his death simply a tragic consequence of years of physical and emotional strain? The answer is likely a combination of both. Elvis was a man who had achieved unimaginable success, but he was also a man struggling with deep personal demons, and the drugs that once offered him relief eventually took everything away. The story of Elvis Presley's life and death is one filled with contradictions. He was a man who, at the peak of his fame, could do no wrong. His voice was unparalleled, his charisma undeniable, and his influence on music and pop culture eternal. Yet, as we've explored in this video, there was another side to Elvis, one marked by loneliness, emotional turmoil, and addiction. While the official cause of his death was heart failure, it is clear that the drugs Elvis took to manage his physical and emotional pain were a significant contributing factor to his demise. Prescription drugs, in combination with the stress of his personal and professional life, took their toll on his body, eventually leading to his untimely death at just 42 years old. The shocking truth behind Elvis's death serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of addiction, especially for those in the public eye. No matter how powerful or adored someone may be, they are not immune to the same struggles that affect countless others. Elvis's tragic end also highlights the importance of mental health and the need for support systems in an industry where image often takes precedence over well-being. While we may never fully understand the full extent of Elvis Presley's personal battles, his story offers valuable lessons about fame, addiction, and the price of living in the spotlight. His legacy lives on in his music, but also in the cautionary tale of a man who was as vulnerable as he was legendary. As fans, we can honor Elvis's memory by not only celebrating his immense contribution to music, but also by acknowledging the darker side of his life. Addiction is a disease, one that has affected countless individuals, and it's a reminder that even the most iconic figures in history can be touched by it. So while the king may no longer be with us, his music will live on forever. And perhaps in remembering him, we can find a way to better understand the complexity of fame, addiction, and the human experience, both the light and the dark sides of it. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped history.